We good? Good afternoon, everybody. A warm welcome from my side. It's good to be here. An exciting event for us. It's been a whole year of waiting, so quite keen to get things underway. But first of all, just to welcome everybody online and in the room, colleagues from PSG, the representatives from ERSA, Economic Research and Southern Africa, our keynote speaker, Dr. Chris Luwald, and our esteemed panel of judges, of course. And then last but not least, think of our three finalists today as we announce the winner for this inaugural PSG Think Big competition. Our three finalists in alphabetical order, Johan Fourie, Madoda Sitshange, and Teboho Nthoana. So with this competition, what we try to do is obviously provide a platform for young academics and research people working in the industry, but also households, to get a little bit closer to the economic policy conversation. I think every household has conversations around the things that concern us and could bother us. And at some point you think, why not this idea or that idea? And I think it provides such a nice platform for those ideas that could go unnoticed if there wasn't a platform like the one that we have here, for these ideas to come to the fore, be formalized in papers and take flight. Obviously, what we're trying to do is to address some of the socio-economic challenges that we face as a country. There's never a shortage of ideas, and the implementation side of things normally the area where we tend to struggle a bit. So it's going to be really interesting to hear how these papers take flight when they are taken up by ERSA, who's also let us know that they are going to essentially convert them into policy briefs, and then from there communicate them through to the various stakeholders in policy reform networks, and see where there's take up to hear some more on how these ideas could really benefit our broader society. The reforms the need for reforms are actually quite obvious, and it was encouraging to see that there were almost 100 competition submissions for this competition, which is very encouraging to see. People are very engaged with the issues that we face. And as I said, they came from all avenues: academics, thought leaders, economists, researchers, students, and households. The ideas provided some innovative concepts around fostering inclusive growth. And I must say, well done to all the entrants and all the people that took the time to put their thoughts onto paper and to perform that submission. It takes a lot of work and it takes some courage. And then also especially congratulations to the three finalists here who obviously provided the best papers among that 100. I think regardless of what happens today, it's a phenomenal achievement, and I think you should be very, very proud of that. All these entries will be made available on the ERSA website, and the top three will also be published on the PSG website. I mentioned the policy briefs already. And I must say, when looking through some of these papers, it was obvious that they came from places that are as diverse as what South Africa is, and they covered topics as diverse as our country is. And our judges surely had to deliberate quite a bit to get to the final three, but we'll be talking more about that in good time. But first, from my side, I would like to invite Dr. Chris Luwald to the stage to share his views on inclusive economic growth in South Africa. Chris politely asked me to not elaborate too much on his resume, but at the same time, I've got to do our keynote some justice here. He holds a PhD in International Economics and European Studies. He's the director at the Economic Research Southern Africa. He's head of the Department of Economic Research at the Reserve Bank and an MPC member. And the list goes on, but I'll keep it there for you, Chris. Thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. Let me start by saying definitely drop the doctor. Just Chris is fine, especially in a room like this with so many other doctors. Thanks very much for inviting me to say a few words. First, I'd like to congratulate the finalists of the inaugural Think Big competition. Reading your essays reminded me of how little I know about the complex world we live in and how hard it can be to think through our economic challenges. Your analyses are innovative and capture well the difficult trade-offs present in economic policy. I'd also like to thank the organizers of this event. It's been a long time coming. Competitions like this are, in my view, a great idea. They provide a fantastic platform for discussing our economic problems. We need far more engagement and dialogue as they are critical to forming a common sense of how to move forward. So more of these certainly need to be in the pipeline. So I've joined you today not as the chief economist of the SARB, which really gives me a great amount of pleasure because it means that I can escape talking about monetary policy, which I have to do kind of constantly, and it's really nice to talk about something different, and in particular something that I've spent quite a long time thinking a lot about through a very long involvement with ERSA, Economic Research Southern Africa, along with some other people in the room, including Mr. Elias Masalela there and others who have been stalwarts in keeping ERSA going and giving it direction over many years. ERSA is a co-sponsor of this event as well. I've also been a pretty long-standing observer of the South African economy, having, before my time at the bank, worked in the Treasury for many years. So the comments I make today are my own and in no way attributable to the Reserve Bank. Just to repeat, no monetary policy. So the other great thing about today is that this competition is about solutions to problems. And so I didn't feel like I had to come up here and say anything about solutions. I could actually take a rather different tack and say a few things at a high level about some of the things that over the many years I've been in South Africa seem to get in the way of improving the economy. And some of these things, many of these things will be very familiar to you, but what worries me is that they still get in the way. And I would like to see that change eventually. I won't try to overreach, and I'll try to keep things pretty simple. So let me start by saying that, of course, South Africa has experienced about 15 years of weak economic growth. In fact, the 2010s were the worst decade of growth in the post-World War II period. The economy expanded by only 16% over the decade, compared to the 39% expansion experienced during the decade before. I also apologize. I usually do presentations, not speeches, so this is a technology that's I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. Between 2013 and 2019, per capita income growth was either zero or negative, averaging negative 0.4%, and is likely to remain negative for the rest of the decade. About 55% of South Africans fall below the poverty line. We have many young South Africans entering the labor force every year, but the rate of job creation is nowhere near sufficient to employ them and to also deal with the normal churn that we see of jobs lost in the economy. Since 2008, the labor force has grown by 33%, while total employment has only risen by 15%. The inability to create jobs lies at the heart of many of our economic challenges and certainly is the major factor in perpetuating inequality. Better outcomes are on the horizon. I think that's reasonably clear, but the near-term outlook for growth still remains below par and not what it should be. Output growth this year is expected to be around 1.1%, well below longer-term averages of about 3%. Contrast this to growth in other emerging markets, which are forecast to average 4.1% over the next 3 years. Today, investment levels are just 15% of GDP, again much lower than the 25% level, consistent with more rapid economic expansion. So one of the many curiosities we face, and I faced in my professional career for many, many years, is why, given the amount of work done on our severe growth and inequality challenges, we seem to make little headway in solving them. South Africa is certainly not the only country in the world where much economic analysis and policy advice is discounted, but it is unusual and begs the question of why we give so many of the good ideas short shrift. I want to highlight a few of the reasons I see for this, and this is where things get a bit complicated. First, South Africa's inward-looking history gave rise to a set of approaches to some very big and very important economic ideas that has made it hard to take advantage of them. In this list, I would include the importance of cross-border economic activity, trade and capital, how they impact on growth, and integration into global value chains. The cost on not being a more open economy are both large and pernicious, not least in nurturing a focus on import substitution rather than taking advantage of the knowledge creation and the spillovers associated with global markets. South Africa could have done better with the endowments it has. They are many. And there is quite a lot of domestic innovation here. But much greater diversification and much better outcomes certainly could have been achieved if we compare ourselves to other countries, and also across a much wider range of human capital. And I think this is an important point. A simple measure I like of success about our interaction with the global economy is whether or not it has helped the economy's overall size keep pace with population growth and the level of human capital. But as I noted above, our high level of unemployment shows that this just clearly has not been the case. Second, and in part because of our inward focus, we too actively manage or set rules for how our markets work at a microeconomic level. Price movements are there to signal to economic actors whether to produce, not to produce, create jobs or not, and so on. But we obscure such signals when we get regulatory controls wrong or when they cause prices to be fixed or move only in one direction. This fundamental challenge affects a wide range of critical markets, from labor to energy. In the labor market, it results in weak demand as prices cannot adjust for productivity. In energy, it results in excess demand and fixed supply. In both cases, the opportunity costs to the economy are very large, never mind the many social costs. My third area of concern is the balance between the public and the private. We like to argue a lot here about whether a reduction in the pace of growth in public spending is austerity or not. For what it's worth, this particular question is both well answered by the data and not terribly useful for making progress on economic growth. The right question is whether our public services are fit for purpose. That public services are necessary for economic growth and inclusion should really not be the subject of great empirical debate. More pragmatism about the role of the public sector, whether it should be bigger or smaller, is needed, and it should be based on measurable outcomes. We need to recognize that where outcomes of public services are poor, inclusion will be the very first casualty, in part because the private markets that are left over will discriminate between those able to pay and those that cannot. Again, this observation need not be overly contested, but it does and should place a burden on the public sector to modernize and improve what it does, including, at times, competing with the private sector. Public services should be focused on making economic inclusion as costless as possible. And that principle of measurable outcomes and the bar we're setting there about making inclusion costless as possible should extend throughout the public sector to all domains where they are appropriate and where they matter. This should include housing, this should include transport, this should include all facets of urban planning and many of the other spatial dimensions of our economic lives. Getting this right will have fundamental economic benefits, in my view, even if some of these are quite indirect, and we don't think about these often. In particular, I think a lot about how public services reduce the cost of labor supply, feeding eventually down the line into the competitiveness of exports or import competing goods and services. Better public services make the cost of economic activity lower, and this really needs to be a critical focus area. Finally, I want to cut against the grain a bit of most economic instruction, which separates out microeconomics from macroeconomics, and which suggests often that microeconomic factors and outcomes do little to constrain or create opportunities for macroeconomic policy. In the real world, this is unhelpful in some very critical respects, not least in how it affects how we think about the macroeconomic policy environment. As I noted earlier, there isn't much data to support the accusation often made that the fiscal authorities are pursuing austerity. Since the GFC, our budget deficit has on average been around 4.5% of GDP and is forecast to remain at 4% over the next 3 years. In my footnotes, I can give you the public debt numbers, but I think you probably all know them. But it is fair to say that over the last decade, more spending has done little for economic growth. I've set out a couple of microeconomic reasons why that seems to be the case, but simply put, we don't get value for money, as a notable Chief Justice has put it recently. Does this mean we borrow and spend more to reach that elusive growth that we want? Or should monetary policy just need to be loosened radically, and that this would generate lots of economic growth as we borrow ever more? So here's the challenge from a macroeconomic perspective. When our consumption exceeds savings, we run a current account deficit. If growth fails to increase, and keep in mind that capital assets account for 5% of government spending, then we get more portfolio flows that encourage more consumption rather than the direct investment that encourages productive capacity. As a result, our debt rises and costs more. Our sovereign risk increases, both raising the long-term cost of borrowing and depreciating the exchange rate. This fails, however, to balance the current account deficit because inflation rises and in turn reverses any of the temporary real exchange rate gain we might have had, and because spending never falls. So this is a vicious circle, and one that cannot be made better with more expansionary macroeconomic policy settings. Bringing the macro and micro together, we can think in terms of basic aggregate supply and demand curves. Our supply curve is inelastic, and shocks shift it to the left. Take away energy, what happens to your supply curve? Shifts to the left. This reduces real growth and increases inflation for any rise in aggregate demand. More positive shocks, like fixing the energy problem, alternatively shifts the supply curve to the right, while better functioning markets at the micro level flattens its slope and delivers more real GDP and less inflation for every increase in aggregate demand. So the key here is to get to the reforms, structural primarily, certainly investment-driven, that help move that supply curve. Spending can help in that goal, but it has to be much more effective and targeted and benchmarked more widely against best practice in the rest of the world. These ideas are hardly new. They are similar to those presented in Michael Spence's 2008 growth report, where they looked at the fastest growing countries, 25 fastest growing countries over long periods of time. They're similar to those presented by Danny Roderick in his Growth Puzzle book. And they're very similar to the lots of work that Ricardo Hausmann has done, especially his Growth through Inclusion report, and the list goes on. But far too often in our corner of the world, we ignore the microeconomics and settle on demands for more spending or cutting interest rates as quickly as possible, despite the abundant evidence that these don't work very well. At the end of the day, bad microeconomics makes good macroeconomic policy very hard, and it certainly cannot be solved. They certainly cannot be solved by making them worse. They need to work better together. So it's past time to move from that vicious circle to a virtuous circle of growth. Key to this is to let the evidence basis direct our views and our actions, no matter how strongly we want to hold on to our beliefs. I think that is clear, and that is the life of this engagement that we're having today. So let me conclude by thanking you for giving me the opportunity to say a few things about my own about the growth challenge that we face, and I will now give way to the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Very insightful indeed. A frank and honest summary of how things stand at the moment. What I take from that is that obviously it's well known and well reported that we've been through a very rough period in South Africa from a macro and micro economy perspective. Growth has been slow, largely driven by the inability to create sufficient jobs. But things are looking better, but we need to get much better value for money when it comes to public spending. And then what I think is quite a valuable comment, especially given the context today, is give the good ideas, not the short thrift, sorry. And poor public services has financial inclusion as its first casualty, which is not really the ideal situation for us. So with that, I think it leads into our panel. I'll now hand over to our panel of judges, facilitated by Alicia Seckham, to discuss the entries and the judging process and the ideas that were brought forward by our top 3 finalists today. Thank you very much.
Whole lot more equitable. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I think the context pretty much set at this point, right, by both Adrian and Chris as well. As has been said, PSG, together with ERSA, approached and invited the country's big picture thinkers to come up with innovative solutions to some of the country's biggest challenges right now that are limiting its growth potential, but also a sustainable future from here on out. So we're going to be getting straight into some conversation at this point with the judges, or a few of the judges who have had the arduous task of having to filter through over 150 entries which came through in this competition, and then whittling away further at that to get to our top 3 finalists that are here with us today, the winner of which will be announced a little later on. So a quick introduction to 3 of our judges who've managed to join us today. I'm going to start off with Michael Sachs. He's adjunct professor at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at WITS. Mamokete Lijani is chair of ERSA and a strategist in global markets as well. And then Professor Philippe Burger, professor of economics and the dean of faculty of economic and management sciences at the University of the Free State. So welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us as we see all of this hard work culminate to this. And I'm going to start off, Michael, with you, because we started off this competition pre-GNU, right? GNU now in play, and with the shifts that we're starting to see, how receptive an environment do you think we're dealing with right now to policy proposals that could work to unbungle some of the structural challenges the South African economy faces, some of the impediments that have hamstrung the country's progress as well, especially when we've got these proposals coming through from members of civil society?
So every cloud has a silver lining. And the silver lining of the dire situation of the last 10 years that Chris described is that it doesn't take too much brain power to work out what it is that government needs to do in order to accelerate growth. The path ahead is very clearly marked by the very obvious obstacles in the way of that path, such as electricity supply, our port and logistics, and our overall export and trade infrastructure, which Chris also spoke about the importance of. And public services have been in a downward spiral, which is the only area I'll disagree with Chris, that clearly very large cuts to expenditure on those services is one of the factors behind that downward spiral, but certainly not the only one. So I think in the next 12 to 18 months, the GNU doesn't really need new policy ideas, is the truth. It simply needs to get those basics fixed. But hopefully, in the next 12 to 18 months, fixing those basics will put us, take us maybe even back towards the historic average of 3% that Chris mentioned. But that will be insufficient to resolve the very deep social cleavages that, in my view, are at the heart of the fact that we have such a low average growth rate in recent years, even beyond the last 10 years. And so we will need to debate new policy ideas beyond the next 12 to 18 months. And I think that's why the field is rich and open for proposals, particularly that try to link efforts to overcome those social cleavages, to overcome the deep division and segregation of the past in a manner that is connected with new opportunities for growth and investment. And I think the GNU as well, if it prospers and survives, it will only be because they tackle that set of conundrums.
Absolutely. And Mamakete, you know, what is encouraging is if you're looking at the entries that did come through, I mean, these submissions are coming through from an age group that starts at 17, ends at 70. I mean, that's got to be encouraging because, like Michael says, you know, we're not short of the ideas, but what this competition started off, you know, wanting to achieve is getting this conversation going amongst average South Africans about how we now start to take the next step. Yes, putting and debating new policy ideas, but also focusing a lot more on the implementation of such.
Yeah, I mean, I was bowled over by how varied the submissions were, how many there were, how interesting many of them were. I think the brief was for people to look more from a macro perspective, and some people were looking at a sector specific or at a small problem, and some of the detail that came out of some of the submissions on very narrow issues, and you could see what the multiplier could be. Was very, very interesting. So I actually was quite impressed by how many people were actually applying their minds and how varied the submissions were, and a lot of them were quite surprising to me. So I mean, I think it's very important that we anchor whatever the proposals are, as Michael has already indicated, within the society that we live. And when you get this organic, almost outpouring of ideas, it's coming from the source, from people that are involved in the space, you're more likely to get to a solution than if you get one that's being imposed externally. So I found that really, really useful to actually have people that are in the space trying to solve for themselves. At the same time, there was definitely a sense of history in terms of like some of the most interesting proposals, the ones that I found resonated the most with me. It really spoke about where South Africa comes from, what the history is, what the narratives are, and how whatever the solution must look like must include and involve grappling with that narrative, changing the narrative, and as Michael says, actually inputting new information or at least development that creates the situation for the narrative to change. And I always thought if you can at least get that right, so that it's not something that's talking about some other people somewhere that have a different history, but it's talking about the people here with their history, and you embed the solution in that, you're more likely to get further than where we've been so far.
So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty then of the proposals that actually emerged as the top three, right, Philippe? And I'm going to start off with you because we discussed at the launch how, you know, decades post-apartheid, we have an economy that is still defined by exclusion, current policy not achieving inclusion, not achieving empowerment in practice as well. That said, there was a submission with a focus on how we effectively foster economic inclusion and growth with the redistribution policies of the past having failed and often with negative consequences. So talk us through that proposal specifically.
Yes, so this is a competition about inclusive economic growth. And what is interesting when, at its most rudimentary level, when you ask people what do you understand as inclusive economic growth, people would think, okay, you're going to get a grant or a handout or but that is not what inclusive economic growth is about. It's not just about the sharing, it is also participating in what is being created. And it is also not working as an employee, but also being part of those who decide what is to be produced. And I think what struck me from this competition is also when we talk about inclusive economic growth, we can't sit like, the Israelites waiting for Moses to arrive from the mountain and to give them, what the truth is and what you shall and shall not do. No, this is a conversation where the conversation itself needs to be inclusive, and that is what I also pick up from so many of the entries that we saw. Is that the conversation itself needs to be, and in a sense, this is just the beginning. Because if, we can wait, and we name some of the big names who contributed, to the debate in South Africa, but we must make that debate ourselves. We need to see letters in, like in the olden days, you open the newspaper and there was a letter to the editor. But when you open up your social feed, you need to see letters from people on these precise debates, so that we can stimulate. We need to take the debate to the people, and that way you start fostering the conversation, and we start to build an idea nationally as to what we in South Africa understand to be inclusive economic growth.
Yeah.
And I think that is, and hence the papers, yes, so they are ideas of the past, but also what struck me, and as judges, that is one of the things we looked at, is, are there papers with novel ideas?
Okay, so on that, in that vein,
Yeah.
I want to bring Michael in. Novel ideas, right? This paper focused on innovation policies, strengthening state capacity, creating a new narrative for progress, one of the papers that was submitted. Because of timing constraints, given that we've only got 30 minutes to delve into all of this, I'm going to focus specifically on the innovation policy part of this research paper and ask you, does South Africa's National Development Plan, Michael, not provide adequate enough a template for this already? I mean, what was this paper proposing different to that, especially now where you've got something like Operation Vulindlela tackling some of the most serious binding constraints with help of the private sector?
The economist Mariana Mazzucato suggests that what is important is that growth doesn't only have a rate, it has a direction. And that we need to go along a particular path, and the way we should define that path, in her words, is with a mission orientation. And I think it is true that the National Development Plan, one can point to, I think it has 119 commitments in it, but I'm not sure whether it really contained a mission that all South Africans can buy into. Again, Operation Vulindlela is doing wonderful work addressing the problems that I mentioned earlier on, but I'm not sure whether kind of fixing ports and privatizing electricity generation also constitutes a kind of social mission that the country can unite behind. So the paper you're referring to recognized that it's not enough to preach the gospel of innovation, but you have to actually mobilize the flock, in other words, the nation, behind that gospel in a way that makes a meaningful change in people's lives.
Yeah. Michael, with that mobilization agenda in mind, I mean, the collaborative spirit that we've got going now, something we've got to leverage, and I almost want to say while it lasts here, but let's be a bit optimistic, right? From an investment perspective, the paper proposing greater investment in R&D to drive diversification into high value sectors specifically, all of which does not need to come from government alone. So what's the thinking around tax incentives, sector specific subsidies, ways to increase private sector investment in R&D so that we get this mobilization agenda going?
I think when we talk about innovation, it's really important because it's a kind of a truism that growth and innovation are essentially the same thing, right? Growth, there is growth because there is innovation. I mean, there's some growth you can have just because the population increases or the commodity prices can go up, but over the very long term, it is change that drives growth. Now, we shouldn't confine innovation to being high-end kind of tech industries or something like that. In any case, for a country like South Africa that, as Chris mentions, is somewhat inward-looking, but is in another respect extremely cosmopolitan and open to the world. The problem is that how do we capture those innovations for ourselves? Let's not forget that one of the greatest South African innovators took his innovations to the USA and became the richest man in the world. It didn't really benefit South Africa much. So we shouldn't, which is a lesson that we shouldn't when we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, we shouldn't confine it to that. We need to connect it with, as one of the other papers did, the township economy, for instance. Innovations are not only about technology, they're also about social arrangements. They're also about the institutions we build and the markets we shape at a very local level that are connected with people's welfare.
Yeah. And Mamokete, we've got to bring it back to basics as well, right? And that's what this paper did, because the reality is that this kind of investment in innovation would have to come hand in hand with an investment in human capital at the core. We've discussed before, you know, how researchers are seemingly good at describing the inequalities that plague schools, but actually less successful in making any headway to solving for them. So how innovative an approach, adopted this time when it comes to how we start getting that education system on the right track?
I think the problems with the education system are well ventilated. The solutions, or at least the suite of solutions, is it's available, and it's become a political process. We've seen all the noise around the Bella Bill, for example. So, to me, when it comes to investing in human capital, I think when you look at education, you miss something. You miss the fact that there are adults in South Africa who are a lot less productive right now than they would otherwise be. They might not be highly educated. They might have been subject to educational outcomes that we don't like or that are suboptimal. But even at the level that they are, they're still being underutilized. So I think there is space to innovate around that. And I think that's where the paper that Madoda, for example, wrote, which speaks about how do you use, you increase the productivity of social grant recipients by directing the cash towards improving their ability to create businesses, etc. These are people that are already there with the education levels that are there already, but they've proven already that they can be more productive, and it's about enabling that productivity. So I think the education story, it is very well ventilated. The outcomes will only manifest in a generation, for example, but it doesn't mean that the workforce, or they're not a workforce at the moment, but they could be, but it doesn't mean that the people that we currently have in South Africa cannot be better utilized, cannot be more productive. And that, Michael speaks about innovation being around social arrangements, around policies. It's one of the things that came out of these papers, for example. This was a very intriguing proposal, which is why it ended up as one of the top 3, which spoke about actually using people that are already there with the cash that are already there and just changing the policy around that a little bit to improve productivity. And in that way, you get growth. So, yeah, education, we can, I think that is well discussed. But this is the bit that we were looking for, that little thing that we hadn't thought about.
Okay, and what I like is happening here is it's showing how these three submissions are also nicely connected, right, in terms of the theme weaving into the next, and how if the one gets solved for, the other one comes into play, and the next as well. Philippe, let's talk about building these inclusive economies more constructively, because Michael alluded to the paper that was talking about unlocking the untapped potential that sit in township economies in South Africa, specifically through innovative micro-investment ecosystems and entrepreneurial empowerment. Now, I know this is a very big topic to unpack here, but, what was highlighted in terms of the challenges that persist in that regard and the proposal being tabled to overcome them?
So I mean, when you look at South Africa, and specifically if we talk about the informal sector, for instance, so I mean the SESI survey, the numbers that came out of that showed that there are 800,000 people in this country who got jobs in informal firms. That's somebody it's a small enterprise or employing 1 or 2 or 3 people, but the people they employ, there's 800,000 of them. Now, we very often make the informal sector off as if it's not that important, but 800,000 is more than works in mining. Okay, it's almost as many people as work in commercial agriculture. So if we can, and most of these enterprises is basically in our township areas, and it is and that is the big question. People very often say, yes, we need to formalize the informal sector. And I think what this paper did was to say that there's more than just registering for VAT around this. You need to create ecosystems to foster these enterprises. And how do you do that? And the micro investment, that whole element there, I think is very important. We know that the barriers to entry is one of skills, but it's also capital. And how do we, so if you are a small enterprise and you walk into a big bank, you not always get your way because you do not have collateral. So we need to think about different ways to mobilize resources. And I think this paper, what it did was very much highlight that the fact that we need to think differently about this. How we're going to mobilize is a sort of an all hands on deck approach. It's partnerships. It's about creating ecosystems to support that. It's not, I remember in 30 years ago, when they did small business development, basically what they did is they put a lot of containers in a sort of a park and say, there you go, you have your facility. Luckily, we've learned in the meantime that that's not the way to do it. It really requires an environment where you foster this, and the registration for your VAT is not necessarily the first thing you need to do. There's other ways and other things you need to do to become sustainable, maybe small, but a sustainable enterprise.
Yeah. How out of a box thinking approach came through on this paper for you, Michael? Because, as Philippe's highlighted here, traditional collateral measures don't apply, when it comes to backing loans or extending credit facilities within this market specifically. And at the same time, you've got the scale and the opportunities that these markets kind of put on the table now just simply too hard to ignore.
I think that it's kind of a well-known, stylized fact, I suppose, or if one looks at the history of economic development, that if capital, productive capital, is in the hands of a very small group, is narrowly distributed, it is likely that growth is going to be lower, because it tends to result in excessive levels of consumption and wasteful expenditure. And so it is fundamentally important to find ways of extending credit and access to capital to those who have viable ideas that can generate value over time. And we need a more concerted approach, I believe, to that. And that concerted approach can draw on some of the strengths that South Africa has, such as a very well-developed and sophisticated financial sector. And at the moment, I think we remain in these silos of the private and the public sector, and in this old kind of quite passé debate about markets versus the state, when in fact we should be focusing on ecosystems and complexity that is out there with many different institutional forms. And I think the strength of this paper was pointing exactly towards that, rather than this. And I think across the board, the strongest papers were not trying to make their strength was not about a specific policy proposal that nobody has ever thought of before, actually, a big idea, but pointing towards practical and incremental ways that we can move in a different direction.
Yeah. Can we draw at this point, Mamakete, on any evidence-based strategies, that that show effective transformation of informal sectors into, let's call it, sustainable engines of economic growth? Because in practice, that's the problem, right? We've got the idea, we know what has to happen. In practice, that's where we're falling short.
I think that the interesting thing about formal versus informal is that a lot of businesses that are now formal used to be informal. So, this idea that you're stuck, you're either formal or informal, it's about whether when a business grows big enough that it can no longer sit outside the formal arrangements, then it moves from informal to formal. So this idea that, if a small business, there's certain business of a certain size will be more likely to be informal, but over time. Of course, there are also sectors where entire sectors are almost entirely informal, that are like a feature, like in South Africa, the taxi industry, for example. And that, obviously, in that, there's been an advantage to getting that more formalized, having more access to credit, creating a better institutional infrastructure around those businesses and getting them, and you saw that over time, they've gotten better access to credit, etc. So there is that, but I think for a business that sits as an informal business that sits in a township, for example, what does formalization mean? Does that mean you can pay tax? Does that mean you create an identity around that so that as a lender to this organization, you can rely on the law, for example? So it's a company, it's run on certain principles, and therefore it lowers sort of, not barriers per se, but it makes it easier for lenders to understand and therefore for them to extend credit, etc. So I think that we need to lower the costs of formalization because there are advantages to formalization of companies. So that for me, the whole formal, informal, it's not about the size, it's about what are the institutional advantages that accrue to formality, and how do we make formality less expensive so that companies can then become formal, and then they're not subject to taxes that they can't afford, labor laws that are maybe, in that way. So that's how I would think about it.
Are we seeing any shift happening in that kind of sentiment? How's financial players starting to lean into this concept of not so much a strict formalization, Philippe, of the informal economy, but more so, a hybrid model that can see you leverage off what is a buzzing economy?
I don't think we see it sufficiently, and I do think for various reasons. I think there's still the idea that formalization is a big bang approach. Yesterday I was informal, today I'm formal. No, it ought to be. There's a number of things, like Mamokete said, there's a number of things that you need to do to link up with the formal with formal structures. It's yes, it's opening a bank account, it is registering as a business, it is registering for. There's a number, but you don't have to do all of that in one day. And some things it would make sense for such an enterprise to do some things now, and maybe the other thing next year. So I think that is the one aspect. Then there's also, I think, on the side of the formal sector. And I use the example, I think, when I did the online presentation earlier this year. There is the integration of the informal sector with the formal sector, and an appreciation on the side of the formal sector as to what value the informal sector can bring. So, and then I'll give you a little anecdote. So in 2018, I went to a development economics conference in Bogota, and in the shuttle from the airport to the hotel happened to sit somebody who was a previous minister in Peru. And we started to talk about the informal sector, because in Peru, informal sector is something like 80% of the economy. But what was interesting there is that, and she used an example, if you are a formal business, the cleaning services in your building is done by informal firms. Here, what do? We outsource that to a big JSE-listed company who basically bring the cleaners to your building. Why not empower those very same cleaners to have their own little business, empower them with a basic capital to buy vacuum cleaners and everything they need, and then you create, and whether they are registered immediately, that's maybe beside the point.
Yeah.
I think there's also something in terms of our VAT system. Of course, if you buy something from somebody who's not registered for VAT, then you can't claim input VAT. So there's all these sort of obstacles that prevent the integration of the informal sector into the formal sector. And I think, well, besides the long history of the apartheid government actively oppressing and suppressing the informal sector, there's still all of these municipal bylaws and things, that prevents all of this. And that, I think, is all of that history together explains why in South Africa the informal sector is relatively small compared to the size of the informal sector in other countries. And I think that's an important question, because there are 2.5 to 3.5 times as many unemployed people as there are people working in the informal sector.
Yeah.
Now let that number sink in for a minute, because why are those unemployed people not active in the informal sector?
Yeah. And it's an important question, because if you get that right, and if you solve for that, Michael, it makes the proposal that came through in the third paper that we're discussing today, more compelling. One of the first conversations I remember having with you, Michael, was around the Universal Basic Income Grant, and that's exactly what, the third paper putting on the table in terms of a policy proposition, promoting the integration and the synergy between social security cash transfer programs and then small business incubation programs that Philippe's touched on. And this is how we start getting this working, right?
There are, again, I think the boundary between formal and informal, I agree entirely with Philippe that it's very complex. And one of the challenges we have actually as a government compared to many other governments in the world is we struggle to extend government activity into informal activity. So for instance, if you think of like one of the famous examples in China was called a barefoot doctor, right? That used to go around in the rural areas. But in South Africa, we really struggled to maintain some kind of informal system. One of the other areas where this emerges is in early childhood development. Now, there are two kind of approaches you can take to early childhood development. One is to essentially deliver it through by expanding the existing public schooling system down lower into grade R, and now we're going into grade RR, etc. You could take the same amount of resources and give it to women in townships who run creches. And have a different impact on social relations in that area. Of course, once you do that, all kinds of questions of formalization arise, because the children in those creches that are being subsidized by the government have to have proper nutrition. You have to protect them from people who might want to abuse them. You can't just leave it to you. You need some level of regulation. But then to what extent do you say, well, but they must be VAT registered, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a complex, it's not an easy question, but I think it is one of the central questions that we should be thinking about in promoting an economy with a broader base of economic participation.
Because, Mamakete, this is exactly how we shift the conversation from, social grants triggering dependency amongst a population, and instead getting it to focus on the kind of springboard effect it could have, for that very same population, a potential game changer.
The thing about it is that, what is coming through from both the contributions made by Felipe and Marco is that there is a sense in which there are barriers to economic agents exercising their economic agency. And maybe there is a historical aspect to that, and we need to be more intentional about lowering those barriers. Because for me, if I think about an unemployed person, they're an economic agent, and they do have agency. The question is, do we enable or do we disable them from exercising that? Or how do we help them on their way? And as a social grant recipient, I think one of the stats that comes back is the one that came out of the paper was that 2.5% of social grant recipients use the money they get, or is it 1.5?
1.2.
1.2. You see, I'm actually even upping it because I'm sure it's bigger, to start small businesses, right? And we know that a lot of people use it to facilitate their work searches because they live so far from work, etc. So the social grant is not, these people are not necessarily dependents because they cannot do anything else. We need to start thinking about what are the things that are stopping them from exercising agency to the extent that there's something stopping them, but also how do we make it easy for them to exercise their agency. Obviously, like a social grant can be a way of doing that. But what are we saying about a social wage? Where do people live relative to where work opportunities are? How do you get people from there to here? I've always said, and I'll use this example, anybody who's ever spoken to me knows this example because I use it all the time. I don't understand why, if I'm sitting in Sandton and I need to get lunch, I need to use Uber Eats and order a meal for 100 Rand, when Alexandra is 4 kilometers away. And there's somebody at Alex who would be willing to sell me food for 25 Rand, but they can't.
Yeah.
That to me, that distance between Alex and Sandton and my lunch, it needs to be explained. And that is where I think there is an opportunity. I'm sure somebody at Alex would be happy to come to Sandton and sell me lunch. Why can they?
See, it's this kind of food for thought that we've got to be exploring a little bit.
It's not a free lunch.
It's not a free lunch.
but it really does fuel this argument where, the basic income grant may, on the one hand, the argument being that it can weaken the credibility of fiscal policy, but it may then have, positive spin-offs for the economy. And this is how we start to reconcile the two, right? Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I'm going to open up the conversation to the floor. So I'm hoping that you've all got some questions ready for our panel today. And if you can indicate by show of hand, if you do have a question for any of the judges with us today, please indicate, and a roving microphone will find its way into your hand. Any questions at this point? None? Oh, there we go. Very well.
Please.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. My name's Feriel Hafaji from the Daily Maverick. I wonder if you could quickly paint for us a picture of what such a world would look like in each of the 3 winning essays, should it succeed. I'm just trying to get my head around what does it look like.
Okay, let's separate these, right? So we've got 3 papers, what the winning world in each of these scenarios look like. Stronger, faster together. Michael, on your side? What does that world look
Well,
like?
I don't like the question because it creates the sense that there's some big idea that will fundamentally transform the dynamic, and I suppose that was the ask of the competition. That's why it was called Think Big. But actually, proposals that attempt to do that are not that compelling. And all of the winning papers, I think, point towards more a path of incremental change and not how can we fundamentally kind of almost wave a magic wand and have a different world, but a hard struggle behind improving the path of development.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's
So I'm not answering the question.
here, but
I'm quite aware of that. Yeah.
No, but I agree with Michael. It's if it was only one thing, we would have done it by now. Okay, so it's never one thing. We live in this complex world, and the issues we face are so multi-complex, and I think that is also what the diversity of the papers showed us. Yeah? There's people who wrote about education. There's people who wrote about. We even had proposals for tax systems. We had potholes. Yes, we had even had honeybees. It's a whole range of things. But I think that brings us back to what we said earlier. We need all hands on deck. We need all ideas on deck, and that. But I think what the paper you just talked about. There's one aspect in that paper, and it's also something that Michael highlighted. We can fix all these things that the harbors, the electricity, and all of that, but we need that big idea, that direction, that mission, and what is, and I think that paper highlights that we need something to, as a country, to where are we going next then? What is it that we want to achieve together? Because the rest of the stuff is the operational stuff we need to sort out and fix, and it's not rocket science. We know how to, there's people run successful harbors in this world or successful railways. We just got to, get with it. But what is not so easy is, because we have a particular context here, is what is that big idea that we want to pursue? Mm-hmm. I always talk about the fact that we have, I think it's now 13, 14 million people who need to urbanize in the next decade or so. Okay? That's almost the size of Gauteng. We need to build an extra Gauteng-size urban areas across the country. How are we going to do that? What is the idea? Because we need to mobilize around that, And we talk about green economy. We talk about this. We talk about that. We talk about how to get informal sector in. But all of this is little components that we can add and feed into this one thing. If we want to build South African cities over the next 10 years. How are we going to do that? And what's the role of each one of these policies, these role players, from the spaza shop all the way to the biggest company?
Okay, so Peril, I don't think they're going to give you a picture of the scene. So then let's shift focus, Mamokete. What now? If we talk implementation of proposals like these, realistically speaking, because there seems to be, a gridlock on key decisions and ideology that limits South African society's full potential and capability. So how do you take these ideas beyond being just a few more good ideas, and actually advancing these ideas to policy?
Sure. How would I know?
You're the chief ERSA. You're going to be putting this forward.
Oh, my word. I mean, I think we've spoken about the fact that South Africa is not short of ideas. And there's something that fails at implementation. And I've always said, we need to go to the heart of why that is. So it's not just about, access to capital, because we know that South Africans don't have a capital problem necessarily. So what is it? It's not access. It's not about access to good ideas, because we've generated so many just with this competition alone, let alone all the ones that we've had over the years. So the problem is I've said the problem is political. Then I've asked people. I've said, okay, if you're a political analyst, that's where the question needs to be extended, because that's where the answer is. So, you know, and that when it's when I say political, it's not, oh, it's ANC or DA or EFF or whatever. It's maybe about, you know, how do South Africans cohere? How do we have a common understanding of what it is that we want to solve for? Where are our differences? You know, we're a very diverse country, and maybe that's why consensus can be so elusive. Because if we can agree on a few things, like I was watching the US elections, they agree on a few things that are terrible ideas, but they seem to agree on that. It's like they say, oh, this is a bipartisan issue, it's open and it's shut, and I'm like, it's a terrible idea. But they agree on that, right? And it feels to me that some of these societies, maybe they've had a lot more time to talk about, you know, who they are and what they want. And so they can coalesce around a few ideas like, you know, tariffs are, you know, great, and, you know, fiscal expansion to the stratosphere is fantastic. Here we like still squabbling because I don't know. So for me, it does feel very much like it's a political question.
Yeah.
And that's why I was very excited by the emergence of voices that actually place the question there. So, you know, the paper by Johan, you mentioned that it does speak to this together and creating a narrative around which we can find commonality as part of the core ideas. There's some papers that we didn't include, and there was one that really resonated with me that spoke about, you know, what are economic arrangements within an Ubuntu framework, which is a framework that houses most South Africans. That's how they see themselves. That's how social arrangements are made. And politics are just social arrangements, and economics are just social arrangements at the end of the day. So it was interesting for me that somebody actually surfaced that Ubuntu is a cultural framework which is radically different in some important ways to how we live. So how do you get everybody who grew up in that framework to buy into this one, to actually get together, have a discussion, and agree? You know, so I found that, I think that is at the core of it. So we talk about communism, socialism in South Africa being at odds with capitalism. I think the issue might be a lot deeper than just, oh, these are communists and they're Marxists. And it might be more fundamental than that, you know.
And it's getting people on board, right?
Yeah.
You know, getting these conversations going about how we start rethinking South Africa's growth strategy. So this was certainly, you know, a very energetic way to start to get South Africa's citizens more involved in changing South Africa's economic trajectory, allowing for this constructive engagement at the end of the day around what needs to change to realize the country's full potential. And so thank you all for being involved in this. And I think on that note, we've managed to run anticipation high enough at this point. So thank you to our judges for sharing your perspectives, your insights with us today.
Thank you.
And as we leave the stage now, I'd like to hand things back to Adrian to officially announce the outcomes of this inaugural Think Big competition.
So it's time. So all the excitement and all the insights are a lot to absorb in a session. From my side, I would like to invite Janine, our marketing director, to the stage, and Fourie, on behalf of ERSA. Thank you. Thank you to our judges. We really appreciate your participation and the amount of time and effort you've put into this, all the insights today. So it's now the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's try that again. Let's announce the winner of the Think Big SA 2024 competition. And I'll remind you that the winner will receive 300,000 Rand and will be crowned SA's Big Picture Thinker for 2024. Congratulations to Teboho Nthoana. Yay, well done. Bubbles, dat langs je staan. Second place is Johan Fourie. Dis die third place. Ek het dit delete want ek het nog nie gebruik het nie meer nie. Yeah. Lastly, third place, Madoda Sitshange. Well done. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Get the winners.
Okay, so we've kept you long. So the last bit from me, just to say we're excited to announce that we're building on the success of this year, and the competition for next year will be around the topic of how the capital markets can enhance economic performance and facilitate job creation, which was actually a key component in today's discussion. So excited about that. And the even better news is that we're upping the prize money, and the winner for next year will receive R500,000. And we've made it even better. In addition to that, there will be 5 additional prizes for different categories of 5 times 100,000 Rand each. So a lot in it for the guys who take the effort to put something together for us, and we look forward to kicking off the next competition. Thank you for attending today. For the guys around, please enjoy the refreshments downstairs. It was great to have you here. The atmosphere in the room has been fantastic, and it was good to listen to everybody and all the insights. It's a great initiative, and long may it continue. Thank you.